Good morning again. I have students who could major in PowerPoint. I cannot. So I have evolved my skills as far as the visual part, but I'm still using old CDs, so bear with me. I think it'll all work out. When we have that panel next month, John Miller, wherever you are, you see I'll be all ready by that time. I'll have my sound integrated and everything, so I'll give myself a month. So I've been asked if I would speak about the essential influences of Canadian choral music, and I changed the preposition. So, because I think it's a little bit different. So, at any rate, I want to give you just a little bit of background history to this, and I'm quoting from myself because a lot of this comes from the first chapter of a book called Conducting Women's Choirs, Strategies for Success, for which I wrote a book on women's choral music in Canada, and thought it would be important to give context. So, just for a little bit of that context, first of all, like America, the United States of America, Canada was heavily influenced by European elements because, of course, a lot of people had that background. So according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, which is a wonderful source of information on this, Canada's musical development ran parallel to the basic European style periods, from the Baroque to the classical, Romantic, and contemporary. But because early Canada lacked any kind of patronage system, and therefore professional resources for opera, symphonies, and so forth, musicians who settled in Canada from elsewhere, or those trained in Europe, were essentially cut off once they came. And we've read that same kind of thing happening with people coming to the United States of America as well. Resourceful musicians sought inspiration from foreign models, but really until the middle of the 20th century, the influence was always from the outside, sort of overpowering what was coming from inside. Something that was interesting to me in my research was that singing schools also took place in Canada. I learned in my graduate music education classes, of course, about Lowell Mason and all kinds of things and the effects of singing schools in the States, but really did not realize until I came back to Canada that this, of course, happened north of the border as well. So it spread west from the Maritimes after about 1800, and for over 100 years it contributed to the improvement of church choirs. There were a number of early musical societies, including the New Union Singing Society. That was the first in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That was 1809. There was one in Quebec in 1820, and then the Philharmonic Society of St. John, New Brunswick in 1824. And then the population spread west, so by the mid-1800s there was one of those in Victoria called the Victoria Philharmonic Society. In Quebec, they retained their penchant for folk music, and many songs became very popular, among them Vive la Canadienne and things like that. Then hymnals and sheet music publication began to take hold, so it was easier for people to get music, and they started building their libraries. And after 1850 is when we started music education in the schools, and the Toronto Conservatory, or the Royal Conservatory of Music of Toronto, we used to call it the CON, began its national system of graded examinations. That was founded in 1886. And John Miller and I were talking yesterday about the background of Canadian students. He asked me how they compared with the students I'd had in the States. And I said that the one difference I noticed was that because they had come up through that Royal Conservatory system, they have to have achieved a certain level before they can apply to be a music major. Their theory skills and their knowledge of music history is much greater than that of any students that I had in the States. Now, that's not to say that they are necessarily better musicians. I always had smart students in the States, and they quickly caught up. But it means that there's not all that remedial work that sometimes we had to do in the first year. It doesn't seem to have to go on because they've gone through this very graded system. In the Toronto Children's Course, for example, from the time the children are 5 or 6 and come in, they begin theory lessons. Or if you take piano, you take theory as a part of that. You may have a different teacher, but you're expected to do the two things. So that's really been a big benefit of the Royal Conservatory system. Oh, I'm still here. All right. National music festivals. You got more than you bargained for, you got 2. But I'm just going to talk about the national music festivals. There's also a Canadian system of music festivals that's been in place since 1903, Many of us grew up with that. We got a week off school in the spring. Maybe that was the reason we liked to go. And because I grew up in Nova Scotia, there was also a separate folk song category, and that took a whole day or two before the week of the festival. And all these little children would get up and sing She's Like the Swallow, and all kinds of folk songs. A Froggy Would a Court and Go, that was one of my particular favorites. And just stand in the middle of the stage, and that was just the norm, and those festivals still exist. Regardless of what you think about competition, they have fueled a lot of interest in choral music in particular. And then in 1970, something called the Canadian Music Competitions, or Concours de Musique du Canada, was formed to establish a high level of hierarchical competition that goes all the way to a national level, and that still exists today. Then the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was for many years highly influential. They sponsored a national choral competition, and now they co-sponsor it with the Association of Canadian Choral Communities, or ACCC, and the Canada Council of the Arts. But choirs would work toward that goal of getting into the CBC competition, and you always had to do a Canadian work, so it meant that this led sometimes to commissions and so forth, adding to the repertoire. Then since 1940, there's been kind of an explosion of growth in terms of composition, the rise of university music programs. There are 20 music departments in the country. I know that sounds minuscule, but before 1940 there were not. There were about 3. We have the Canadian League of Composers that was formed in 1951, the Canadian Music Centre that I'll talk a little bit more about later, Canadian Music Educators Association was 1959, and ACCC was in 1980. If you think about that, it's only 33 years old, whereas the United States organization has been going for more than 50, so I think there are things that we can learn. And each province now has a choral federation, which would be like a state ACDA organization, except that ACCC is not the umbrella. Those federations grew up first, and then ACCC, so it's a kind of an interesting, almost upside-down model. Professional choirs, Iman mentioned the Vancouver Chamber Choir, Intima, Musica Intima, Elmer Eisler Singers. Those are all a very important part of the Canadian music scene. And the children's and youth choirs are very, very strong in our country. And so that, again, has given rise to more composition. Canadian Music Centre has 800 associate composers. And those are people who, you have to have Canadian residency. You don't have to be a Canadian citizen to belong. You have to apply, and your works are screened by a panel. So when you think 800, that's quite a number, and yet people like Eleanor Daly, who Eleanor says, oh, I haven't bothered to do that yet, and people know who she is. That sounds like Eleanor. She'll get around to it someday. She is not a member, so that is to say that we have notable composers who have chosen not to do that. But it's a repository for scores. You can borrow things for months at a time, wonderful recordings, all kinds of podcasts. Their website is great. It's a great resource. There's one in Western Canada, in Calgary. The head office is in Toronto. There's one in Montreal. The Atlantic one, I'm sad to say, has been closed due to lack of funding. So I've already alluded to the fact that choirs have a huge influence on repertoire. Provincial and national youth choirs. Most provinces have some kind of youth choir that occurs once a year. I'll give you the Ontario example because that's the one I know. Every summer, they audition students between ages of 16 and 23. They choose 40 from around the province, and they come and spend about 10 days working very intensely with one conductor. And after that time, then they do about 3 or 4 performances around the province, usually ending up in Toronto. And the alumni of that single organization that's been now going 31 years just flood the schools across the country in terms of being in opera programs, being teachers at universities, having private studios, just being known on the Canadian vocal scene as well. And last year, in Macmillan Singers, which is the chamber choir at U of T that I conduct, out of 41 members, we had 11 who were Ontario Youth Choir alumni from 2011 when I conducted it. That's almost a quarter of the students. And to them, it's a matter of pride. They want to be in that. They can go to the National Youth Choir if they're in the quartet that's picked from the provincial choir. So again, it's that competition, but it does lend itself to a high level. And those groups commission. So every year somebody is writing for their concert. The National Youth Choir in 2014 will have 4 students from each province and from the Northwest Territories as well. And they will commission a composer. That's Peter Tanya, who's from Halifax, because Podium is going to be in Halifax, so we wanted to pick an East Coast composer. And so because of commissions, again, we're adding to the repertoire. Then I mentioned the children's choirs. The Toronto Children's Chorus really started a huge movement in our country. 1978, Jean Ashworth Bartle founded it because Andrew Davis, who was conductor of the Toronto Symphony, needed a choir for Mahler II, I think, Mahler VIII. And he knew she had a wonderful school program, just really outstanding, and she also had a wonderful church choir. So he said, Jean, can you put something together? So she said, sure, I can gather some children and we'll put this together. And out of that grew the Toronto Children's Chorus, which now has, 6 different choirs and these theory programs and private voice lessons and everything else. The other thing that was important to that was that Ruth Watson Henderson was their accompanist for many years. And she then wrote a lot of music for the group. They began to commission. Gordon V. Thompson publication picked up this the Toronto Children's Chorus series, and I can tell you that just because it says Children's Chorus on the front does not mean it's easy music. So depending on the text, much of that music that's in the series or was written for these children can be performed by community women's choruses and so forth. So that's been an important influence. Then the professional choirs, the festival singers. Elmer Eisler was probably the greatest influence on Canadian choral music in terms of performance. He founded the Festival Singers. It was 40-some singers. They toured in Europe. He co-won a Grammy with Igor Stravinsky for their recording of the Symphony of Songs with the CBC Orchestra. That was back in the 60s. And there were some political issues that went on, and eventually Elmer was asked to step down from that, but his retort to that after a year or so was to form the Elmer Eisler Singers, which took the group from 44 to 20. Much more easy to tour, much less expensive, and that group still exists now as one of the very few professional choirs in the country. Lydia Adams is the conductor of that group. Then Vancouver Chamber Choir, which is John Washburn. He's been there since the beginning. And single gender choirs, Electra and Corleone, which are also from British Columbia. If you look at Electra's website, they list all of their repertoire for 26 years. And there's a great deal of Canadian music there. Really, really wonderful stuff. So let's go to the major influences. I think there are 3, and the first is the folk music element. We have many collections of native music in Canada, and again, the Canadian Encyclopedia is really a great source of information for both Anglo-Canadian and French-Canadian. Many people chose to collect, sort of like Kodai did in Hungary, people chose to collect the folk songs by going around and listening and writing down. So people like Barbeau, Roy Mackenzie, and Helen Creighton, who was particularly known for her work on the East Coast, their work was really essential in collecting folk and Aboriginal music, and that resulted in this huge amount of music coming to people's awareness, and then composers like Healy Willan and Sir Ernest Macmillan and W.H. Anderson began to arrange those. So if you go to the Canadian Music Centre and you look for old music back from the 1920s and 30s, you find all of these arrangements of Canadian folk tunes, both English and French, by some of these early composers. Many English-speaking composers were, of course, sort of driven by the church music style, the Healy Willan school of doing things, like Sir Ernest Macmillan, whereas the French-Canadian composers like Claude Chopin and so on, and Jacques Itoux, who was more contemporary, represented the more modern influences. So you see elements of Scriabin and Debussy in their writing. So starting with the Anglo-Canadian, Canada being settled from east to west, it was people from the British Isles who came originally, and much of their music reflects the occupations. The The largest number over the last 300 years of these songs you can trace directly back to Britain and Ireland. There were fewer songs composed in Canada than were imported, which makes sense if you think about it. And nearly all of the native Canadian tunes borrowed their music from old world sources. Most of the native Anglo-Canadian songs were inspired, as it says here, by the occupation. So if you think about it, how did they make their living? Fishing, farming, logging, those kinds of things. So we have lots of sea shanties, and particularly on the east coast in Newfoundland. New Brunswick and Ontario, it's more about lumber camps, sometimes where they're talking about the winter's work. Sometimes they describe tragic accidents that happen. There are smaller numbers of songs that came from sailors on the Great Lakes, miners in Cape Breton and BC, and the homesteaders and the cowboys on the prairies. Newfoundland is especially rich in its tradition, and I'm going to play just a little bit of Feller from Fortune for you, which some of you may know. Harry Summers arranged this, and he took this compound meter, bum, ba dee, da da, da da, and dressed it up a little bit, so there's quite a bit of 7/8. And I always use this for a conducting exercise for my 4th year class, because if they can do this, they can do Stravinsky. Just a little bit.
Swing around this one, swing around shake, dance around this one, dance around that one, diddle dum this one, diddle dum diddle dum.
And you get the idea, and you hear the way they're speaking right around here. You hear that very sharp R. We would not sing our British influenced choral music that way. American influences. This is really interesting. Last night, that song that we sang, the Prairie song, Brainerd said to me afterwards, "That's Beulah Land." And it is Beulah Land. In Western Canada, what happened was that they really produced very few of their own songs, but American songs found their way across the border, and Canadians then adopted or adapted them. So they took American tunes like the Little Old Sod Shanty and Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. Alberta Land became the new text for that, or the new title, or Saskatchewan. And the song that on the Stephen Chapman's arrangement, it actually says something about a Manitoba folk tune. It really is based on Beulah Land. So talk about vertical. We already were getting pretty vertical back in those days. Other native songs reflect the influence of historical events. Come All You Bold Canadians, Ruth Watson Henderson. This is 1812, the War of 1812. There was a lot of emphasis on that in Toronto. And so my students in the fall, when we sang this piece, they got a real history lesson about General Wolfe. And that was important. They didn't know. And so we used that music, and now they're a little more educated in that. Then the Franco-Canadian, that's the second major folk influence. French colonists along the St. Lawrence River, they really kept to themselves for a long time in small rural communities, and their cultural isolation helped maintain the vitality and the strength of their traditional culture. The songs are pretty basic, straightforward, with a rudimentary kind of meter and simple vocabulary. Some French-Canadian songs derive from a medieval French tradition, but the ones that actually grew up in the French-Canadian community talk a lot about the life of the voyageur, the lumber camps, disasters, misfortunes, all that, just like you would find in America when the pioneers are writing about their experiences. And Acadia, which is part of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick into Quebec, has long had a rich source of this type of music. We're going to look at a piece by Danet, Le Pont Mirabeau, which is in your packets there, as an example of music by an early 20th century French-Canadian. Actually, the bridge he's talking about is in Paris, but this piece has become a great favorite in Canada, and when I did a little survey earlier this year, asking people for their sort of top 10 Canadian tunes, this one came up on a lot of people's lists. If your French is not up to par this morning, you can sing on the international language of do, and that will be fine. And we're just going to do a little bit. So just a little reading. Here we go on do or en français, s'il vous plaît. Before, but that gives you an idea. It looks easy because it's homophonic, but there are some interesting little harmonic things in it. And then a slightly different style, also from French Canada. Do you have a thermometer there? Donald Patrickson is a Canadian composer, arranger from Sherbrooke, Quebec. He taught at McGill in Montreal for many years. And this was another one of the pieces that was frequently mentioned by people as being very well known. I'm going to be kind to you and have you start at the repeat. So we just work a little on the tune. The text is easy. Assis-moi moi, ne voulez danser. If you can say that, you can probably keep going. You have to know capuchon. And that will take you almost all the way through the first verse. So here we go. We'll ignore the repeat, so we're starting it lively, just 4 measures, and then in sopranos. If you want to resort to pum, that's lovely too. And so forth. There's a wonderful SSA arrangement also by Patrickson, but that just gives you a little flavor. That tells about life in the communities of Quebec in the sort of Saturday night community dances. Then another example, which you don't have in your packets, is Blanche comme la neige by Sir Ernest Macmillan, who was the conductor of the Toronto Symphony, but did some wonderful choral writing. And that's one of the pieces that also comes up in the list. Then First Nations is the third element, and Beaumont mentioned some of the tribes in British Columbia. The First Nations really encompasses several ethnic groups, and they use music for social and ceremonial purposes. It was all melodic, monophonic at first, but in those traditions they consider song and dance to be sacred. There are about 25,000 Inuit who live in northern Canada, mostly spread across Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavik, which is northern Quebec. And before they had any European contact, their music was based around drums. But then they began to include fiddles and accordions, and believe it or not, one of the influences now is American country music. You get technology, and you get, back in 1961, CBC started a radio station, and all of a sudden they could get all this music. So they have accordions and fiddles and all kinds of things going on. And many of you may know about, I'm going to skip over the Micmac for a minute. Many of you may know about throat singing, and you can look on YouTube. You see two singers facing each other, and they're singing to each other, and it's just as if the sound waves carry one back and forth to the other, and the idea is you keep trading back and forth until you run out of breath or somebody starts to laugh. And I don't have the hang of it. I don't know that I ever will, but it's a lot of fun to watch. And at Festival 500, which is a wonderful choral festival in Newfoundland every 2 years, on the odd years, in 2011, some of the Newfoundland choirs that were working with people in Labrador brought throat singers to the conference. And so we saw this happening. And I believe that those same people went to Brazil for the IFCM symposium, because I know they were getting ready to do that. But there's a real richness there. I mentioned the Micmac Honor Song because it's what I consider to be a crossover piece into the next element or the next influence, and that is because it includes some Indian Micmac chant, but it also relates to this idea of the Great White North. Everybody thinks that in Canada it's always frozen. It is colder in North Dakota right now than it is in Toronto, but I know Toronto is more south than the north. So we have this Great White North, and Murray Schafer's Epitaph for Moonlight is kind of the iconic piece. How many of you know that or have done it? Is that a piece that's familiar? I'll show you a little bit of the score. Now I have it so that you can, it's stapled now. Because you can imagine what this is like in performance, but you can see from a distance how it's graphic notation. It's very atmospheric. Schafer is a composer who is passionately concerned about the environment and has been from the 1970s. He invented the term soundscape. And so a lot of people who are environmentally conscious see him as their hero, and he writes a lot of his music to be done outside. There's an element of mysticism, all kinds of things. But this was the one piece that in my survey came up more times than any other piece. And every time I've taught it, the students just love to sing it. It's hard work, but you can teach it before. They have to be able to do half steps, whole steps. It's wonderful for ear training and very, very atmospheric. Other examples of this type of music, which I think is very characteristic of graphic notation sorts of things. T. Wayden, Harry Friedman, if I can just show you. You see lots of grids, this kind of thing. And in Canada, we talk about +2 is a major second and -2 is a minor second. So you have your pitch and it'll say +2, you're going up a major second. Now, sometimes students will say to me, now why didn't he just write that? Because the idea is that you can start it on any pitch that's in the comfortable range, and it's all relative. So that's where it becomes really, really good for ear training. This is in the Toronto Children's Chorus series. So, fear not. Minnewanka Snowforms, those are the same kinds of things by Schafer, but that's one way of accessing the Great White North. And then I want to mention, and not just because Emont is here, but the use of Canadian poetry, which reflects nature. And Vestigia is a wonderful poem by Bliss Carman, who's a New Brunswick poet. And recently, the Women's Chamber Choir at school did 2 settings back-to-back, one by Eleanor Daly and one by Raminch. And Emont's had violin and cello as well, and the students just loved it. The text is a little bit quaint, but it's still universal. So as soon as we translate it and we take away some of the old capital R romantic words, they get it. And it's very, very expressive music. The third category is what we call art music, I suppose, and it's related to current compositional trends. The sort of iconic piece in this realm, back from 1974, again mentioned by these people in the survey many, many times, is Ruth Watson Henderson's Missa Brevis, which she wrote when she was accompanying the festival singers. And she would say to you, I learned everything about choral composition from working with Elmer. She had never written choral music before at all, and now she's a champion of it. And it came from her work with this group, just getting to know what sounds. Another one that's mentioned often, and some of you may know this, is Eleanor Daly's from the Requiem in Remembrance, which is very popular. And Eleanor, of course, says, "Oh, I wish they'd know that I wrote something besides that." I made her sound very cryptic, but she writes wonderful music. And I said, "Eleanor, just be glad they know who you are." Okay. So all of these things, the role of commissions is really, really pivotal. There is less money, yes, but I have found, particularly the emerging conductors, are very willing, and if you've seen something and you know it's good, they're so willing to write for not a ton of money. Now, when you start getting into the upper echelons, then yes, you do have to go to the granted commissions and so on to get money. We had a competition for choral writing at school this year, and I was thrilled that we got 14 pieces from our master's and doctoral students, and some of them were really, really good. We had to read through them all, and then the choir gave feedback to the composers. But I was so excited there were that many of them, because they don't all come to it from singing, who really wanted to write for choir. So these are the top 10 Canadian compositions from this little informal survey. I surveyed university conductors in Canada and community choir conductors. So that is not an enormous pool, and of course I did not get 100% return, whoever does in a survey. But these are the pieces that were mentioned most often as being kind of iconic Canadian, representing those folk elements, the Great White North, and the sort of art music. So it's the Schaefer, Henderson, Ramage, Oliver and Corpus, which is a wonderful piece. The Summers, the songs from the Newfoundland Outports. We heard a little Fella for Fortune. Healy Willens still shows up. An Apostrophe to the Heavenly Host. And the Marian Motets last night, we sang Rise Up My Love. And Dale Borland said to me afterwards, that just doesn't grow old. And there's something about that music that still, today, when I first went back to Toronto, I thought, oh, these students have sung all this stuff, they'll know this. Hadn't done it, so a little out of favor in some areas. They loved it, and what a great way for building tone. Cyril Irving Glick, The Hour Has Come, is an extended work. John Estacio is a conductor or a composer from Edmonton. These are still in manuscript, but you can get them from Canadian Music Centre. Derek Healy, lots of folk song arrangements, Eleanor Daly, and Stephen Chapman, and we did some of his work last night. And the final thing I want to do is just leave you with some resources, and I apologize, these are not on my handout, because I did the handout before I did the PowerPoint. This first book is generic, or I should say comprehensive. It's not just about Canadian music, but there are a couple of really excellent chapters that give you the history and the influences, Cambridge Companion to Choral Music. And then this is a very interesting one. Polly Higgins-Jonas, in their own words, she interviewed numerous Canadian conductors, including Graham, and had them talk about their background and how they grew up in choral music and so forth. And it's really, really fascinating. Dundurn Press is a champion for books about Canadian musicians. They wrote, or they published Elma Eisler, which we'll talk about in a moment. The most comprehensive book that I know of about music in Canada, including popular music, music of the native people and so forth, is this Elaine Keeler, Music in Canada, Capturing Landscape and Diversity. And there's a CD with that that's got musical examples on it as well. It's really a stellar example if you're doing any research. And then the kind of, I guess you'd say it's the seminal work to 1985 was Timothy McGee's Music of Canada. And that, because it was written so long ago now, is mostly about early history, but it's just a standard book. And then Walter Pittman, Elmer Eisler, Choral Visionary. This is such an interesting book for reading about the choral culture in Canada, particularly in Ontario, but Walter doesn't mince words. He's interviewed everybody who ever knew Elmer, good, bad, or whatever. The man was a genius, and the influence that he had in Canadian choral music was really enormous and irrefutable. So I would suggest that those are really good resources to look for. And the Canadian Music Centre, you have the website information there. Just go on that and you'll find many, many examples, both auditory, oral examples, and visual things, PDFs, and you can learn from them as well. So that is it for Music in Canada to this moment.